In the mire there is a village so renowned that every year the daimyo gather there for hanami, or flower viewing. The village, known as Motobu, rests nestled in the heart of a small mountainous region bordering both Valkenheim and Ashfeld. Around the month of March, the peach trees that cover these mountains burst into glorious pink blooms. It is a sight of unmatched beauty, and every daimyo, from the greatest to the least, will put aside their differences for just a while to marvel and bask in the glory of the peach blossoms. But it is not just the blossoms one might see when they visit Motobu. When one walks among the trees and blossoming limbs, one might witness, according to legend, a young woman among the trees and raining petals. Adorned in pink and red and blues to match her home among the beauty, she dances like a spirit, flitting in and out of sights as she moved. Some call her Momo, for it means peach, but the villagers know her by another name, Miura Ayako. Ayako was raised in Motobu by her grandmother named Granny Ran. Her mother had tragically died in a Viking raid on Motobu. Though she remembered little of her mother, she knew that she was a beautiful Nobushi, like Granny Ran had been before her, and so, like her mother and grandmother, Ayako longed to take up Naginata or Yari and become a Nobushi just like them, an Onobu geisha. Though she trained often with spear and sword, Granny Ran ensured that she was educated in etiquette, art, literacy, and tea ceremony. "You must bud into a beautiful blossom, child," she would say, "and though many flowers have their thorns, if the blossom itself is not beautiful, then the thorns will have nothing to snare." Ayako knew better than to argue with her grandmother, especially when Granny Ran would remind her of how important these things were to her mother. Ayako asked about her often enough, and Granny was always quick to tell a story of beauty, bravery, and compassion, but above all, loyalty. Yes, that word seemed to appear in every one of Granny Ran's stories about Ayako's mysterious mother. Loyalty. "Loyalty is its own reward, little one," Granny Ran would say sternly, tapping her walking cane. "Do not ever doubt the devotion your mother carried to the Maya and to the Empire. If you are to serve the Empire as your mother did, you must never forget the importance of that." And she wouldn't. Ayako held firm to that teaching. She loved her home, the mire, and the samurai. She would forever hold resentment for the Vikings, the knights, the Wulin, and whatever other warriors emerged to threaten her homeland. "You will be a warrior on par with your mother, little Ayako," Granny Ran would praise. Granny Ran loved talking about her mother, but this always led to Ayako asking another question. "What was my father like?" she would ask. Granny Ran didn't like answering that question. She would snort angrily through her nostrils and huff, banging her stick on the ground. "Do not ask me about that detestable man," she would snap. And that was all she would be told about this mysterious man she called father. This always bothered Ayako. How bad could her father have been for Granny Ran to hate him so? Ayako would grow up beautiful, strong, and above all, loyal to the samurai. However, when she turned 22, she had a fateful encounter that would change her life forever. It was Hanami again. All of the daimyo of the mire arrived in the village to prepare for the viewing of the peach blossoms, and it was there she met him. He rode in wearing the kimono of a samurai, but he had the build and face of a gaijin. His hair was short, cut close to his head, and it was the color of an oak tree. He strolled into the town, and all stared at him with looks of awe, fear, and disdain. This was the Black Dragon, Richard Blackthorn. Only 2 years ago, he had been named Daimyo of Kawamachi, an unprecedented and unheard of act, making a foreigner, a gaijin, a daimyo. It was almost unspeakable. Just the sight of him in the village caused many to retch and shift on their feet, for in Motobu, loyalty was paramount. However, he was still a daimyo, and respect was owed. All bowed to him, even if reluctantly. Richard walked down the road and smiled, seemingly unaware of the looks and glares he was given, and as he passed Ayako, he paused a moment to look at her. "Your head. Raise it, please." He spoke Japanese poorly, but he was understandable. Ayako did as instructed and raised her face to him. Richard stared, and his eyes widened in disbelief. He made an exclamation in his own night language and turned to a woman that had been behind him. She was a samurai, or at least she was in appearance. She wore a red kimono, and her hair was tied back. She bowed and approached with a sly smile that carried an air of mischief to it. Good morning, she said coolly. I am Kimiko, the wife of Lord Blackthorn. He asked me to interpret for him as his Japanese is still poor. May I ask your name? I am Miura Ayako, she answered. Miura! Blackthorn cried. He spoke again frantically, and Kimiko listened carefully before speaking. Lord Blackthorn says, I know your name. It was the name of your mother, and you bear her likeness. I was dear friends with your father years back. Would you—
That is enough!
Kimiko's voice was cut off by the loud, shrill shriek of Granny Ron, hobbling out on her cane furiously.
I forbid you to say one more word!
Granny, Ayako cried. You are in the presence of Lord Blackthorn of Kawamachi, Kimiko hissed. You will show him your respect or suffer the consequences.
Oh, don't start talking tough to me, woman. You're 3 decades too early to be ordering me around. This is Motobu, and it is this time for flower viewing, a time of peace and lowering of arms. You spill 1 drop of my blood, and you'll answer to the Emperor in a heartbeat for sullying the sacred time of year.
Kimiko bristled but said nothing. Granny Ron knew the customs of the mire better than anyone, and she was demonstrating that here perfectly well.
And I say again, I forbid it. I forbid you to speak anything more.
Blackthorn, who looked rather confused, turned to Kimiko and spoke to her in a hushed tone, while Ayako turned angrily to Granny. Granny, Lord Blackthorn says he knows my father.
Hush, child.
But Granny, what if he could tell me more about—
I said silence, she snapped back. If I wanted you to know about that wretched bastard of a man, don't you think I'd have told you? What have I taught you, girl? Loyalty is its own reward. Your father is a traitorous snake, a villain. You would do well to never hear about him and forget he was even mentioned.
They were both cut off by Kimiko, giving them both a curt nod. I am sorry to interrupt, she said coldly, her icy eyes staring at Granny Ron a moment. Lord Blackthorn says, if I have done or said something to offend you, I apologize. I meant no disrespect, but this young lady carries the likeness of Miura Sakura. Is that the name of your mother? Yes, Ayako cried before Granny Ron could stop her. Lord Blackthorn spoke again, and Kimiko listened. Lord Blackthorn says, then it is my pleasure to meet you. You have your father's eyes. Who was my father? Ayako asked.
Enough! Granny Ron snapped. Ayako, you disobedient girl! Go inside at once and do not ask one more question. I will not allow you to know anything more about that bastard.
Bastard. This time it was Lord Blackthorn who spoke himself. It appeared he knew that word. His face was no longer smiling and warm. He looked angry. His eyes narrowed and his teeth clenched. I do not speak Japanese well, but insults are known to me. Never insult him in my presence. The name Stephen will not be mocked. Stephen. Stephen the Righteous. Every single villager in earshot gasped and began to talk amongst themselves. The word spread like wildfire. Every samurai and villager in the mire was likely familiar with that name, and if not, at least the villagers of Motobu knew it. Granny Ron hissed furiously and cursed under her breath. Kimiko herself looked a bit surprised by Blackthorn's declaration, but Ayako looked absolutely shaken. Stephen the Righteous. He was a well-known warden of Ashveld, a night warden of the Gold Legion, but in the mire he was known by a different title. Stephen the Vile. My father is—
Inside, now!
Granny Ron howled, grabbing Ayako's arm and yanking her back towards the house, as the street was now buzzing with this news. Miura Ayako's father was Stephen the Vile, Stephen the Detested, Stephen the Hated. It was like her whole world was crashing around her. She would never have believed it. She couldn't believe it. It had to be a lie, and yet the way her Granny Ron spat and hissed and snarled about the house, there was no chance it was false. She knew. Granny Ron knew that it was true. She didn't even need to hear her admit it. Granny Ron,
forget what you heard. Erase it from your memory. You are not related to that swine, she snapped.
Even if I do, the village will know about it. Granny, please, tell me the truth.
I cannot, she screamed. I cannot, for to do so would further shame your mother than she already is.
Was my mother raped? Was she violated by this vile Stephen? Granny Ron winced and turned away.
If only I could say she was. It would be less shameful than to tell you the truth that she not only willingly pillowed Stephen, she sought him out. But enough on the matter. I will not speak on this. But, Granny, I said enough.
Granny Ron then stormed away deeper into the house to be away from Ayako. Ayako watched her leave and felt a tremble run up her body. It was not enough. To think her mother and the cursed, vile Stephen. It couldn't be possible. To think she was the daughter of Stephen. She had to know the circumstances, know the truth. So she waited for Granny Ron to go to bed that night, and then slipped out of the house, making her way out of the village and towards the palace where the daimyos were invited to stay. It was pitch dark, with only a few lanterns lighting the road. A full moon hung over the castle, casting a strange, eerie glow upon the pink blossoms of the peach trees. Finding the castle was not the issue. Infiltrating it was. She approached the front door where a guard stood waiting, a Shugoki who glared at her dangerously, his club up in a defensive posture. She tried to explain her case that she only wished to speak with one of the daimyo, Richard Blackthorne, but the Shugoki ordered her twice to be gone. Just as she was about to leave out of the shadows, a figure emerged. A shinobi. She wore a red and black vestment, and she bore the sigil of the black dragon upon her chest. She had a mask on over her face, but Ayako could tell she was smiling. "I will take you to see Blackthorne," she whispered. He sat on a cot, wearing a red kimono and reading a scroll of some kind. When the shinobi woman and Ayako entered his chamber, Blackthorne looked up at her and smiled. "You came to see me?" he asked. "Forgive me, my Japanese is poor. Kimiko, would you translate?" "Of course," the shinobi answered, lowering her mask to reveal that she was the same woman from this morning. Ayako waited for the woman to stand beside her lord before she spoke. "You said I looked like my mother. Did you know her?" Ayako demanded. Kimiko translated to Blackthorne, who nodded. "Not as well as your father did, but I'd met her a few times. As I said, you bear a striking likeness to her. Although, to be fair, she was so often wearing her mask that I could not see her face very often," Blackthorne chuckled. "Then what was her name?" "I see you're hesitant to believe me. Miura Sakura." Ayako visibly winced. She dreaded this, dreaded that he would know, for it meant he did indeed know her. "Then my father is—" "Stephen the Righteous. A fine man indeed." "He is Stephen the Vile," Ayako cried. "There is not a single soul in all of my village who does not hate that man's name, or in all the mire, in fact. You say my mother bedded with this fiend? Impossible! You are a liar, my lord," she snapped. Kimiko bristled, but relayed the message all the same. Blackthorne frowned and then gave a long sigh. "Your name was Ayako, yes?" "Yes, Ayako. It pains me to say this, but your father is most certainly Stephen, because I know that your mother was madly in love with him." "You lied to me!" "Ayako, if you thought it a lie, you would not have come here to see me." Richard snapped back, his brow furrowed. "You fear the truth of my words, and you desperately seek to blot them out. But whether you choose to accept the truth or not is irrelevant, for the truth remains in spite of the denial." Ayako said nothing but bowed her head, showing the proper respect to her daimyo. She bit her lip furiously, desperately trying to fight back against the truth she was growing more certain of by the moment. "If you wish," Blackthorne replied, "I will tell you of them, how they met, and how you came to be." Ayako's eyes shot up to look up at Blackthorne. She didn't want to hear it. Every fiber of her soul wanted to shut him up, to flee from his presence. And yet there was a small voice in her heart, a quiet yearning. "I do wish it." "Then take a seat, child. Kimiko, fetch us tea. We have a very long story to tell." "Back then, I was a young man, a lawbringer, only about 4 years into my oath. I was assigned to the Golden Legion. You may not know how that works. Lawbringers, wardens, conquerors, all of us, we're assigned to legions, to aid them, to assist them. The Gold Legion, as you know it, no longer exists today, as the Legion was overrun and destroyed by a massive Viking incursion some 6 or 7 years ago. But back then, it was a very prominent and powerful legion. One of the wardens that I had served alongside with in the Golden Legion was Stephen himself. Even then, he was called Stephen the Righteous. He was a just man, and so skilled in the way of the sword, that other soldiers looked to him as a mentor as much as they did a warrior. I believe he was into his third decade then. I speculate he was 36 or 37 years old. Anyway, Stephen and I were close. We fought side by side in a few skirmishes and battles, and he saved my life more than once. He was like a lion in human form, a ferocious beast adorned in golden armor. I admired him. He was every bit the warrior I wanted to be. I must sound sentimental, and I suppose I am. Those were good days. Anyway, back to the point, of course. The Golden Legion had been assigned to head to the Maya. A young upstart, a daimyo named Hiruzen, had been launching raiding attacks on Ashfeld villages. Stephen was sent, as was I. The campaign against Hiruzen and his forces was much longer and more costly than we'd anticipated. Hiruzen was a brazen and cowardly man, willing to use innocent villages as shelters and hiding his forces among the people he knew we would not kill. In essence, he made them into meat shields. It was costly. Each village we avoided sacking turned into a base of operations for his attacks. And when we did dare to raid a village, we risked harming the innocent civilians within. It was brutal and costly, and the morale of the Legion was very low. So to better find targets, we began dividing our Legion's forces into smaller units of 4 or 5 knights to enter villages and conduct searches for signs of the enemy. If we found them, we would raise the villages. Not an ideal choice, you understand, but a necessary one. Your expression tells me you disagree. That's fine. I don't expect you to understand fully, but that was how we were to handle the situation. In any case, Stephen was in one such unit. He infiltrated the village, and that's when he saw a Nobushi, bearing the emblem of Hiruzen's clan. She was fleeing the village, so Stephen pursued her to a cliff's edge. There he offered her the chance to surrender or do battle, only to see she was not fleeing him but protecting refugees who were trying to evacuate the village. That Nobushi was your mother, Miura Sakura. Like a loyal samurai, she raised her weapon to fight, and the two dueled. But only a moment, for in the heat of their battle, a trebuchet fired in their direction, overshooting its intended target. Stephen threw himself forward and tackled her off the cliff to avoid the impact, and both fell into the lower marshes below. Stephen's leg was broken from the fall, but thanks to his actions, your mother, Sakura, survived, mostly unscathed. She could have killed him, or left him there to die. But her honor was greater than her duty. Instead, she showed pity and dragged him to the safety of an abandoned hunter's lodge. There she tended to his wound, brought him food and drink while he recovered, and over the course of weeks, their suspicion of each other began to lessen. I can't speak to all the details as to their time together, for I wasn't there, but from Stephen's recounting of what he told me that for the first few days she barely spoke to him, growling at him and tossing him food like he were an unwanted pet. But after a few weeks, she was less hostile, more curious. She would ask him how he was feeling, even offering more water if he needed it. Yes, an excellent question. In truth, I don't know how she managed to keep him a secret from Hiruzen. She was a crafty fox, Sakura. Very clever, and always able to remain undetected and careful. The lion and the fox. What an interesting pair. Sorry, where was I? Yes, inevitably, the time would come when Stephen was well enough to walk and return to the Legion. Stephen was, as you'll understand, most hesitant to become Sakura's enemy again. They both owed each other their lives. But the two had grown close, and so they both hatched a plan. Through carefully planted messages in a cherry blossom tree for Stephen to find, she would give Stephen information about certain villages or towns that held Hiruzen's forces. She would evacuate any citizens inside, and as long as the Legion didn't level the town entirely, we were free to engage the samurai inside, removing Hiruzen's greatest weapons and allowing us to end this conflict quicker. A cunning plan, and it worked. Within 2 months, Hiruzen was on the back foot. We were winning. And as for Stephen and Sakura, I'll never forget how often I saw that fool trying to sneak away from camp to that tower. What? Oh, yes, the Sakura Tower. Apparently that region was controlled by Ashfeld in the distant past, and some of our structures remain intact there. There was a watchtower standing amongst a field of cherry blossoms. Stephen and Sakura would rendezvous there. and on occasion I would accompany him as a lookout. I was one of the only few Stephen trusted with his secret. Ah, from the look on your face, I'd say you know something of this tower. No matter. Stephen and Sakura met there many times without our warlords and leaders knowing their true intentions. I'm sure you can imagine what their meetings entailed. I won't go into the details. Just know it was always a pleasant visit. Of course, the time came that Hiruzen offered to negotiate terms of surrender to us. It was a monumental victory. Our commander of the Golden Legion, Lord Jathan, was hoping we could potentially gain some Ashfell territory from the talks. We were all in attendance. Myself, of course, Stephen, and your mother. She was seated at the right hand of Hiruzen's son, Hiroto. You may not be prepared to learn this. Neither was Stephen. But your mother was engaged to Hiroto. She was to be his wife with the turn of the new year. Yes. Yes, her actions in working with Stephen and even seeing him in private were not only in violation of her oath to her liege lord, but her own husband-to-be. I'm sorry, Ayako, do you need a moment? No, it's fine, we can... Oh, very well. I'll tell you what happened, but I warn you, it will not bring you any comfort or peace. Yes. Hiruzen began the negotiations as we expected, even going so far as to blame his son for the cowardly tactic of using villages as meat shields. And rather than deny this charge, Hiroto, the son, then declared his own wife, Sakura, responsible for upsetting his plans by helping refugees escape, thus removing the meat shields. He decried his own fiancée as a traitor. Your mother was honest to a fault. She did not deny this charge. I even remember what she said. If I recall, it was, I would do anything my lord asked of me, but to shame my lord by allowing him to partake in so dishonorable a tactic is too much to ask. She said it with a straight face, too. She showed no fear as she signed her own death warrant. Yes, her death warrant. Hiruzen ordered that both his son and wife would commit seppuku to atone for their crimes. The seppuku would take place at dawn the next day. Hiroto agreed to the sentence, but your mother did not. I'll never forget her eyes when she looked right at Stephen, stared him right in the face, and said, I cannot, for I am with child. You can imagine the resulting chaos from that announcement. Of course, Lord Jatham offered a stay of execution until the baby was born, but before he could even finish offering this proposal, Hiroto was on his feet in a rage. You see, despite her being his betrothed, they had never bedded, so the baby she carried was not his. And Stephen knew whose it was. She didn't need to say it. There was no need. Ayako, you must understand. The rage of Hiroto in that moment was only matched by the fear of Stephen. I'm sorry, it was... Yes, I know you want to hear, What happened next? Hiroto drew his sword to kill his unfaithful fiancée, and Sakura didn't budge an inch. I don't know if she was just ready to die and had accepted it, or if she knew that she'd be saved, but she didn't move an inch when Hiroto drew that sword, and good thing she didn't. Stephen was on his feet in a flash, and the Lion of the Golden Legion was on Hiroto in an instant. He took Hiroto's hand off at the wrist with one swing of his sword, and then cleaved his head from his shoulders in the backstroke. So sudden was his attack that no one even knew to react before Hiroto's head was on the floor. I know how the Maya sees Stephen, Ayako. Kimiko explained it to me. You call him Stephen the Vile, Stephen the Detested. You were told that he burned down villages in his campaigns and killed the son of a daimyo during a negotiation for peace. But that is a story you have been told that only carries a half-truth. Stephen burned villages that were already evacuated by your mother, and he killed Hiroto to save your mother's life and yours. And as a result, his name has become cursed in these lands. I won't try to convince everyone otherwise, not even you. Think of Stephen what you will, but you deserve to know the truth about your father. He was no monster. Your father was a man so devoted to you and your mother, he sacrificed his integrity, his name, and his reputation, all to save the both of you. This is too much. We can stop. Get some sleep for tonight, and... You wish to... No, Ayako, get some sleep, child. I'll arrange a room for you and... Well, very well, if you insist. Dry your eyes, child. Deep breaths. All right, where was I? Yes, Hiroto. Stephen slayed him, as I said. As you can imagine, Stephen's actions were not met well. Every samurai was on him in an instant, ready to slay him, and for almost 5 minutes he was fending them off himself. We were all dumbfounded, still wrapping our minds around what Stephen had just done. And only I knew why, which is why I did nothing. I stared like a fool as the man I admired threw everything away for your mother. And as for her, I think if she'd had her weapon, she would have run to Stephen's aid, but she was unarmed, and she was forced behind Stephen. Eventually, Hiruzen and Jatham brought peace back in order. But Stephen's actions had done more than just save Sakura. They had ruined the negotiations for us. Jatham had to make amends as well, so now no party had the high ground. You know, the more I think on it, I feel like Hiruzen may have wanted this outcome. In the end, an agreement was had. Sakura would commit seppuku in the morning, Stephen would be executed in Hiruzen's own time, and the Golden Legion would leave the Maya for good. In exchange, Hiruzen would cease all campaigns into Ashfeld. We had achieved peace, but at a very painful cost. But Stephen, your father, was still not done. He stood proud and ordered a duel between himself and Hiruzen's champion, not for his life, but for Sakura's. He threw down his gauntlet and declared that he would give his life, but Sakura must live, and he would duel any champion Hiruzen offered for her sake. Hiruzen refused at first, but then Stephen pointed his sword at Hiruzen and said coldly to him, "Deny me this duel, and all of Heathmoor will know your cowardice and disgust. They will sing ballads of your weakness and folly, and when your name is spoken, it will be from jeering lips. Prove yourself to have even a shred of honor, or I will cleave your pompous head from your neck, and you may join your son in oblivion, so you may be spared that humiliation." Stephen always had a way with words. Hiruzen consented. Stephen was set to duel one of his finest Orochi Guard that afternoon. But I wasn't there to watch it, because before he went to battle, Stephen took me aside for a very private discussion. He told me he did not trust Hiruzen to uphold his end of the deal. I was to take Sakura, your mother, far away from there, to use the duel as a distraction to help your mother escape. So while Stephen dueled for your mother's life, I fled with her into the marsh to get her to safety. And a good thing I did. Hiruzen was outraged when Stephen won his duel, and Sakura was nowhere to be found. He had lost his son, his finest warrior, and his traitorous daughter-in-law. Stephen had won in more ways than one. But Stephen was banished evermore from the mire, never again to enter its region on pain of death. And Jatham made sure of this by banishing him from the Gold Legion as well, transferring him to the Iron Legion instead, where he served the rest of his life. I never saw Stephen again after that. Stephen may have won the battles he needed to, but he made a horrible sacrifice. He had to let go of you and your mother. He never learned where your mother fled to, nor when you were born. I made many inquiries to find your mother and learned she'd settled in this region, but I had no idea she was in Motobu, nor did I know that she had given birth to so lovely a daughter. Yes, you do carry her face. but you also carry your father's eyes. That same dependable glare. I know it well. And as for the fate of your mother, beyond that I know not. Stephen's fate I know a little more. He engaged in many battles since then in Ashfeld and in Valkenheim. He went on to become one of the most respected wardens of the order, training up in new knights and wardens-to-be, including the likes of the infamous Punisher Warden, as you may know him. But I also heard rumor that he often spent a lot of his time alone staring off to the mire, and I know all too well what he likely felt when he did. Ayako listened to every word of Richard's story, her eyes flowing with tears and her lip quivering as she fought back tears, because she believed it. She believed every word. She'd convinced herself that she would not trust this Blackthorn in anything he said, and yet each word that she heard gripped her heart with a vengeance, and she found herself not only trusting, but knowing everything he said to be the truth. Stephen was no villain. He was her father. He was no monster. He saved her mother's life twice. Her mother was not a cold and noble warrior of infinite loyalty, for her honor outweighed her loyalty. Her mother was not some unwavering bastion of strength. She fled for her sake to give her life. It was the most wonderful and most painful news she could have ever heard. "Do you need rest? I will arrange for a room to be prepared," Kimiko offered. "I want to know more about my father," Ayako cried. "Please, tell me more about him," she pleaded. "There's precious little more I can say," Richard sighed. "Like I said, I never met with him again after he left the Golden Legion. We went different ways after that." Richard's eyes suddenly widened and a slight twinkle met his eyes. "Of course." "What? Something more you remember?" Ayako asked. "My dear, as I said, I can't tell you much about Stephen's life after I knew him. But if you wish to know more about your father, then perhaps you should seek out your sister." "Sister?" "Not by blood, but she was raised by your father for many years, a warden just like him. Her name is Ruth."